Good evening, everybody. This is John with Murder by the Book here in Houston, coming to you with another live virtual event. Before we get started this evening, I just wanted to make a couple of general store announcement things. As you guys know, we are reopened. We reopened on Halloween, although before that we were doing open by appointment. So people have been able to come in the store in some shape or form since July. But we hope that you will come visit us. We're encouraging masks, but not requiring them. So the staff is all wearing them. We're still doing curbside pickup if you're not getting out. So if you pull up and you want us to run your books out to the car, just give us a call when you pull into the parking lot and we can get those run out to you. I wanted to mention a couple of things that we have coming up. So we just announced yesterday that we're going to be partnering with Sarah DeVello, who has been running the Mystery and Thriller Mavens Facebook page. And she's also been doing really great mystery interviews with A Mighty Blaze and their podcast. But she's going to be joining the Murder by the Book team in a virtual capacity. She's going to start streaming her live events through the store's Facebook and YouTube pages as well. And to kick everything off, tomorrow night, Sarah and McKenna and I will be doing a virtual event at 7 Central, kind of a behind the scenes thing. So if you have any questions about what it's been like to sell books through a pandemic, or what it's been like to pivot from hosting 3 to 5 author events in store a week to hosting 3 to 5 author events virtually a week. We're going to be answering some questions about that. We'll be chatting with Sarah a little bit about kind of her background, why she loves mystery and thrillers, and what her new series of interviews is going to look like. So we hope that you will come check us out tomorrow night. I also wanted to mention before I forget that we have signed book plates to go with all copies of What Happened to Paula. So if you order a copy of Catherine's book this evening, we'll have some signed book plates for that. Also wanted to mention, we haven't had any issues in a while, but just in case we do tonight, if you see any links pop up asking you to click away from the event and put in your credit card info to watch it, those are spam. Don't click on those. I will delete and ban those as soon as they pop up, but I just wanted to make sure that nobody clicks on them before I get to them. So I think that is all of my general announcement stuff. So we are going to get us started this evening. Tonight we are going to be chatting with Katherine Dykstra and Kevin Cook about their releases. So Katherine's newest book, What Happened to Paula on the Death of an American Girl, has just come out. Let's bring her in. How are you tonight, Katherine?
I'm well, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
So Katherine is a writer, editor, and teacher. Her essays have been published in the Washington Post, Poets and Writers, and Real Simple, among other periodicals. She lives with her husband and 2 children in New Jersey. And we are also joined this evening by Kevin Cooks. Let me bring him in. How are you tonight, Kevin?
Hi, John and Catherine. Nice to be with you.
Hi,
You too.
Kevin.
Thank you so much for doing this for us this evening.
It's I get a chance to talk about a book that I admire, What Happened to Paula.
So Kevin is a former senior editor at Sports Illustrated. He is also the author of Titanic Thompson, Tommy's Honor, Kitty Genovese, and The DAP Report, and he lives in New York City. So while Katherine and Kevin are talking this evening, if any of you out there have questions for either one of them, you can post those either in the comments on Facebook or in the live chat on YouTube, and I will be monitoring those, and I will come back in just a little bit and relay those. So if you have questions, don't be shy. And as I mentioned, we have signed book plates to go with Katherine's book. So if you order any of those with us, you will get a book plate. So Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you guys to chat, and I will see you in just a little bit.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. It's good to be part of Murder by the Book, and I suppose, I mean, as I said, I think What Happened to Paula is a special book, and as I was reading it, one of the things that I wanted to ask Katherine was the book seems to examine a lot of things that we come to expect in a true crime book from many different angles. And I think that makes it a deeper book. And I wondered whether that was your idea going in, or is that something that develops as you work on the book?
Yeah, so that was you know, I'm hearing myself back at me. I'm sorry, John.
Okay, can you?
So sorry, I'm hearing my own voice.
Are you still hearing it?
No.
Okay, right, you should be good now.
Okay, thank you. Right. So you asked about how I decided to structure the book, I guess, and how I came to sort of looking at all the different facets that affected Paula's life. Yeah, so when I started working on this book, it was a story that was handed down to me by my mother-in-law. She went to school with Paula, and they only overlapped for a year, but they were acquaintances. And Susan, my mother-in-law, was always sort of haunted by Paula's the fact that her murder had never, or her homicide had never been solved. And when she came to, well, actually, when I first met her, when I first began dating my husband, she was working on a documentary film about the Paula case. And she, at the time, she asked me to be involved. And, as a young woman who was living on my own in New York City, that felt like something I couldn't face. It was scary to me. And so I said, no, I'm not interested in doing this. And she, but I agreed to go on a trip with their family because I was getting to know them. So we went to Cedar Rapids. I went on one of the very first, Paula reporting trips, and just sort of like listened in when they came back from their interviews. Then flash forward, that was in 2008. So 6 years to 2014. And now I'm married and I have a child. And Susan approaches me again and she says that, she's sort of given up on the idea for a documentary because the problem is the crime isn't solved. So, traditionally people come to true crime thinking that they're going to, have a mystery sort of set up for them and then unwrap
the case. Right.
Exactly. And then there's this like satisfaction at the end where they, found out who done it and, and then the conclusion. And because that didn't exist, she thought, well, first of all, she was told that, people weren't interested, the document, this can never work. But when she came to me, she said, I think that there is something here. And I think maybe it's a nonfiction writer. I think maybe a journalist would be better suited to handling the story. And at that point I was, I now was married and I had a baby at home, and I was sort of seeing all of the ways that my own life had changed, in ways that my husband's hadn't. And when I looked at Paula's case, I saw, sort of all of the things that she faced because she was a woman. And I began to think about, how I could write about her life in that way, sort of approaching all the systemic, injustices that she faced.
And in those six, because there were 6 years, is it kind of just gestating? You're turning it over in your mind, or did you not even think about it until it comes around again?
I mean, honestly, I didn't really think about it. Like it was something like my husband's family is all very creative. My mother-in-law is a writer. My husband's in VFX. My, brother-in-law is a photographer. So they were all involved in this project. So it was hard to escape it because, it was the topic of conversation very often, but I really never thought I would be involved. It was not something that I thought I would do. I was doing other projects and true crime was never something that I, it frightened me. Like I wasn't a true crime fan. I didn't watch, those types of shows. I mean, I do now, but I didn't then.
There seems so many. Are there some that you like that, I mean, the forensics of it is, and that's one of the things that brings one to a project like that.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Just the forensics, the detective story that draws one into a story like that. And there's so much of that on television. And I think that in some ways your book kind of interrogates all of the ideas behind those things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Paula's case was really interesting because, she was 18 years old when she disappeared. She had just graduated from high school. She left her roommate's house one evening and, never returned, and was discovered 4 months later by, 2 boys who were hiking with their dad. And, initially the police were completely uninterested. Paula's mother went to them and she told them, my daughter is missing. And they were like, she's 18 years old. This is what girls do. They run away. They go in search of themselves. And so they got no attention, for her disappearance. I think it was like 4 or 5 days before an officer even came out just to interview Mrs. Oberbrockling, about the fact that Paula had disappeared. And then once her body was found, it was sort of the same thing. Like there was this initial push, and all this, they did their due diligence, I feel. But then it was like they just sort of fell off.
Right, they're kind of checking boxes, like, because had she been a socialite or someone like that, one thinks, well, maybe it would have been different.
Yeah, it was so interesting to me because this entire time I've thought that it was sort of the ethos of the media in the time. So there were literally only 3 stories ever written about Paula's death in the local paper, and one of those was her obituary, and another was the discovery of her body. So there was no one like agitating for the police to figure out what had happened to this girl. And this whole time I sort of thought that the reason was that the culture in the media then was different. Like, okay, so now we have the 24-hour news cycle. People are interested in, they love a dead white girl, that they pay attention to them, and this gets all the eyes, and et cetera. And so I thought maybe it was just different then. But then I read Becky Cooper's book, We Keep the Dead Close. That came out last year. That was a really good book. But that was about the murder of Jane Britton, who was killed in Boston, I think in 1969. So this was 1 year before Paula died. And the entire, community, the Harvard Radcliffe community, she went to Radcliffe, and the Boston community was up in arms over the fact that the police hadn't solved this case. It was national news. Like the whole country was paying attention. And the difference was that, Jane Britton's father was a dean at Radcliffe, and Paula Oberbroeckling's parents were, an insurance, sometimes shoe salesman and insurance, and selling insurance, and, a homemaker. And, they didn't belong to the country club. They didn't, they weren't seen as, important. And so, why solve this case? They're not important. Which is, I think, one of the biggest injustices. So many.
That's right. And it makes one want to tell their real stories. I mean, that's certainly a commonality between our books. I read a book about Kitty Genovese, who was killed by a monster who had already killed. But it's one way that not only gender, but race and all other kinds of things enter into the ways that the media approaches a murder of a young woman. And Winston Moseley, the monster in the Kitty Genovese story, had killed a black woman named Annie Mae Johnson, who and had gotten no attention whatsoever. It doesn't make the newspaper. But when the victim is a very attractive young woman, it changes everything that follows. And it makes you wonder, how much things might have been different if the victim had looked different.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. I think so many people fall through so many different cracks. I mean, Paula was beautiful, just stunningly beautiful, but she was, too poor, or, possibly too pregnant. Other people are too black, too, too single, too, slutty, to whatever. And, I just feel like if you fall outside of any of this like tiny little rubric of, this is the ideal victim, then you don't get attention paid to you. I thought, your book is so interesting. I feel like, both of our books sort of, do a little bit to subvert the true crime narrative. And you bring up the media. I mean, I feel like that's one way, like your book is almost as much an interrogation of the media as it is anything else.
It really is. And Paula should have been covered far more in the media. And my story, the story of Kitty Genovese, is really about a media myth that seemed to explain something very special in 1964 in New York City. And it was apathy, it was urban coldness. and the whole idea was that that in the cold city, your neighbors wouldn't lift a finger to save your life if they could, and that becomes the myth of the 38 witnesses, which was front page news in the New York Times because it suited the editor's view of what was going on at that time. Mm-hmm. And I think the social forces, I mean, that's such a fascinating part of your book. I wonder whether you feel like, is that changing? Do books like What Happened to Paula start to remedy the idea that if you're a young woman of the wrong social class, nobody cares if you live or die?
I hope so. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's one of my biggest hopes from this book. You know, there's in my book, I have a quote from Judith Herman, who's a trauma specialist. And she says, you know, those who bear witness to a crime are caught in conflict between the perpetrator and the victim. And the witness has to take a side, right? And all the perpetrator asks is that the witness stay silent, right? And the victim demands action, right? So there's so much more work that needs to be done if you're the witness to a crime and you stand on the victim's side, right? You have to vocalize and you have to take action.
As we saw in the Pulitzer Prizes yesterday, which was such a wonderful story.
Yeah.
And bearing witness, I think, is very much what, I mean, I felt very much reading your book that, and you mentioned at one point very specifically, the pretty dead girl. And that certainly draws attention, but one wants this person to, you hope to tell her story as a living person and not just as a victim.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I wanted to, I mean, I never knew Paula. Right. You know, one of the things that you asked earlier about how I sort of came to my structure, and one of the things that I found so interesting as I was interviewing and talking to people is that I literally did not have a conversation with someone about this case where at some point in the conversation they said something along the lines of, oh yeah, that also happened to my sister or my mother or my friend, or I have a story about that. It was like the stories just over, and I'm talking, you know, everything from, sort of minor, sexual, innuendos to like rape and murder. And, there's a woman in the end of the book who, I didn't know this when I booked the interview with her because I was interested in her knowledge of the flood in Cedar Rapids, which was is a big theme in my book. And we were sitting at lunch, and during the lunch, she tells me that her mother was murdered. I mean, it's like the degrees of separation between women who have encountered some sort of violence are just shockingly low. But so as I started seeing these things, I realized that if I layered them into the story, if I sort of, I could show that it's not, these incidents aren't isolated. And they're systemic and they work together. And by covering them up, by not speaking about them, we serve to cover them up as well.
Right. It's true. I mean, it's too late to help the victim, and in some way you want to help to pay some sort of tribute to her memory.
Yeah. Yes.
I wonder too whether you talked about all the people one talks to and putting together a project like this. Is it the research that you like the most, or the writing of a book?
It's funny. I really enjoy the research. I'm looking at my next project right now and trying to think what I would like to do. And for a second, I sort of decided that I have an idea for a novel, though it's sort of, there's some themes that dovetail with this book. And, but every time I get into it, I just I miss the archives and the going through back issues of the Cedar Rapids Gazette and reading the case file one more time. And that was something that was really, it really drove me, and I could lose whole days, on, especially because her homicide is unsolved. So, there were constantly people saying, oh, maybe this, or, something would just kind of bubble up, like a name or like a car, the make of a car or whatever. And then suddenly I'd be like back into the file, like, searching by makes of cars.
It's that bingo, yes. That keeps you going.
Yeah, it
what
really.
were you doing? Was it microfiche, these records?
Oh gosh, no.
That's the worst machine that was ever invented.
Oh my gosh, no. Does anybody still use that anymore? No.
That was some of my research, and it.
Yeah.
You just
when I was in college, it was the same thing.
Okay,
when I was in college, I did that too. But no, I have a membership to I think it's called Newspaper Archive.
Right.
And they have, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, is as little as they covered Paula's case. The other cases that I include in the book, especially, there was an abortion ring that went down 2 years before, I think it was 2 years before Paula died. And the coverage of what happened was this woman, Sharon Wright, was found dead behind a supermarket in Cedar Rapids. And they very quickly determined that she had tried to go, she was a married woman and she couldn't have any more kids. And her husband had taken her to Cedar Rapids, and they'd tried to get an abortion with this, man and this ring. And, very quickly the police were able to figure out, who was involved. And the coverage of that from the Gazette is just incredible. I mean, they covered like daily the updates and, everything from, her death all the way through, all of the everyday in court and to, the afterward. It's an incredible put together. It's an incredible piece of journalism. And there's a few of those instances where I was just so impressed with the level of reporting in the daily paper. And this is Cedar Rapids is a small town, 130,000 people, and maybe even smaller then. So,
right.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a subtext of the book in any way that these things may change, that it's possible to get more attention to cases like this?
I mean, I hope so. Yeah, that's that's for sure the goal there. I think that, this, if we're a witness, and I have a daughter, I don't want to send her into a world where, I want her both not to be afraid because, but I also want her to, it's like, there's this very fine line. I think that women walk with, you don't want to be afraid of everything around you, and you don't need to be. However, there are lots of, instances where, you
yes,
there. So it's a fine line.
That's sort of part of the whole true crime ethos that what happened to Kitty Genovese is the primordial urban fear. She's locking up her car and going into her apartment, and this figure just springs out of the dark with a knife. And this is something that happens, that there are monsters out there. And in some sense, to tell these stories seems as old as the Brothers Grimm, but then it's as modern as the things that you talk about in your book.
Yeah. How did you come to Kitty's case?
I always thought it sounded fishy, that the story that there were 38 people looking out their windows, not one of them picked up the phone and called the police. And it turns out that that this was a story. I had the great good fortune of working with a woman named Janine Abel, who was a paralegal in the Queens District Attorney's office. And you have that moment during working on a book that you can't believe. It's like the Citizen Kane moment when she says, "Oh, nobody's looked at these in 45 years," and it's a row of cardboard boxes full of documents.
Wow.
And it was also wonderful to go to Columbia and find in the archive of a fellow who worked as a producer for ABC's 2020 what I believe to be the source of this number that the Times reported. 38 witnesses looked out their window and nobody lifted a finger to help Kitty Genovese. Where did 38 come from? No one knew for the longest time. And there was a police document. And I'd love to ask you a little bit about working with the police, which is sometimes exciting and sometimes not. There was a police document that was interviews of all of the witnesses who the police had canvassed and said, oh, yes, I heard something or I saw something last night. And it added up. It was more than 38. But if you counted up the entries, because each entry is an apartment, there's two people live there. Husband says, I didn't hear anything. Wife says, oh, my goodness, I heard it, but then it went away. You add them up, there are 38 of those entries. And I firmly believe that it was some harried civil servant who told the police chief, who was going to have a lunch meeting with the Times editor, oh, 38, that's what the number was. He says to the editor, 38 witnesses, and it's like Joe McCarthy's number of communists in the State Department. It's the number that sticks, and that's what people remembered for 50 years.
Wow. And you make the excellent point near the end of your book, I think, is it a professor who says that, that Kitty might have been lost to history had that, like, there's a weird irony in the fact that, that this is how this story went down, because maybe if they said that there were 2 witnesses or 4, it would have been no story at all.
It could have been forgotten. That's Harold Takushian, who sees a real spiritual side to the Kitty Genovese story that I share in some parts and wonder at in others. But one strange thing is that there were good results from the clamor about apathy after Kitty Genovese was killed, including the 911 system. There was, in those days, you have to call the local precinct. The 911 system grew more or less directly out of the outcry over Kitty Genovese and her murder, as did the Neighborhood Watch program, which has also had good and bad results, but has certainly saved some lives. And these strands that go out afterward are some of the most important parts of the story. I wonder if you've heard from people who are in the book since you finished your work.
I mean, the book only just came out today.
Yes.
But so no, I haven't heard from that many. I was just thinking as you were speaking, so I write about this in the book, but I went to school with the girl who was killed in a horrible way, Stephanie Schmidt. And I'm not going to remember the date. I think it might have been 1993, also in the summer. But her, and this goes back to this sort of idea of activism and getting activated by things like this. Her family just, they devoted their lives for years, trying to get legislation passed this is in Kansas, in the state government, in order to protect girls. There's a law that's, Stephanie's law, things that they had passed. And I mean, so this is sort of going back to your earlier question and saying that I do think that, things can change, like the 911, I think that these cases are, horrible, and also opportunities to, address the problems, that lead to them. So
there's always an outcry afterward, and then it's forgotten, and often, and one hopes that you can make a story that won't be forgotten.
Right. You asked about working with the police. It's very interesting that so Cedar Rapids started a cold case division not that long ago. I want to say within the last 5 years, I think. And I've been in touch with them as I've been working on this case. And my first call, years ago now, was so shocking to me, because I spoke with the detective, and I thought I was going to be asking him all these questions and, getting all this information for him. But really, as soon as I was on the phone with him, he's like, oh, so how long have you been in, and who have you talked to, and what did they have to say about this? And suddenly it was like that he was interviewing me about, anything that I had learned during my own interviewing and research. It's interesting. They the cold case team in Cedar Rapids just solved a huge crime in Cedar Rapids. I think it was 7 years, maybe 8 after Paula's Paula's homicide, a girl, Michelle Martinko, was murdered in her car. There were dead girls all over Cedar Rapids during these years. And she had been stabbed to death in a parking lot of a mall. And that crime also had gone unsolved for 45 years. And while I was working on Paula's case, so this is another case when I was talking about that layering. While I was working on Paula's case, I met a man who was like sort of similarly obsessed with Michelle Martinko's murder as I had become with Paula's. And he shared with me that the cold case team had been able to take DNA evidence out of Michelle's car and use that DNA to create a profile of the killer. And so, 4 or 5 years ago, there was suddenly like an image, and it was, probable height and build and eye color and all these things, and a picture. This is what he might have looked like then and this now or whatever. And then maybe 2 years passed, and they were able to take that DNA and apply it to one of those personal genomics websites, 23andMe or one of those, and they came up with a match there, and they were able to create a family tree and narrow it down to 3 brothers. And then the cold case team, went and took saliva off of a straw that this guy had used in a pizza restaurant. And and now this...
That was good detective work. I mean, they were around the corner waiting for him to finish his Pepsi or whatever.
Basically. And now this man's in prison now. He's been convicted of Michelle's...
Do you think we're going to see a slew of cold cases solved? Because there does seem to be a lot of technology that's doing better.
Yeah. The interesting thing, yes, I think, okay, so in Paula's case, no. I mean, unfortunately, because of there was a devastating flood in Cedar Rapids in 2008, and it literally just, wrecked municipal buildings and evidence and, all kinds of things. And so that happened to Paula. So when I asked the cold case team whether there was still evidence in the Paula Ober-Brocklin case and whether they could search it for DNA, they were very... No, humidity is the enemy number one to DNA, and this will never. But I do think that it's certainly an interesting technology, but it's not unfraught, because like with this Michelle Martinko case, like the case was the DNA evidence. That was it. Like it wasn't. Oh, he knew her. There was no story behind it. There was no. So I think that, and I don't know. I'm not an expert, but I do think that it's an interesting. If there's DNA evidence, then everybody just sort of believes it.
Right. It changes the landscape.
Exactly.
You mentioned the flood, another kind of avenue, and I wonder if when you're working on a project like this, there are these sidelights that you never expected, and you find yourself reading accounts of a flood, and that's fascinating in itself. And I wondered if that was one of the ones that really stood out in working on this book.
Yes, for sure. The flood was so interesting because I mentioned the trip that I took with my in-laws in 2008 before I was involved. And so we took that trip in July of 2008, and this flood, which devastated Cedar Rapids, I mean, it put people out of their homes, and it was awful, like next to Katrina, one of the worst in the country. And we arrived, just 2 weeks after this flood. So, my husband's family descends with like a cinematographer and a director, and everyone there becomes so focused on the flood. Like, it's like they came to look into this homicide, but the trauma in front of them, is the fact that all these people are trying to save their homes and to, to dig out from this horrible disaster. So, so what they came back with as far as documentary footage was all this like pictures of the floodwaters, so it wasn't, they sort of, they couldn't get beyond, the trauma at hand, which I think, makes sense. But then the flood became a theme for me because, first of all, because the city was so affected. So every time you go back, people are talking about the flood still. They're still trying to build the levees and secure, the city. They don't know what will happen. They're actually, and I don't know very much about this, but I know that there was a flood there just recently. They had similar flooding just like maybe 2 or 3 months ago. So yeah, this became a theme for me. And then the fact that it was the flood that had so damaged, all of the evidence and yeah.
Right. Well, I was also interested that you mentioned, and I can't swear I remember all of the authors you may have mentioned in the book, but James Ellroy is there.
Oh yeah.
And you think, in some ways Ellroy is, some of it gets to a fairly scary, violent level. And I wondered, I was a little surprised to see that, tell me more about why you,
well, that's a funny one.
Called him to mind.
So I mentioned earlier that I didn't, up until this, starting this case, I didn't read true crime and I didn't watch it. And I don't remember who turned me on to so I've only read one Ellroy book, and this was his memoir. It was called, I think it's My Dark Places. And it's the memoir of the murder of his mother. And this was one of the first, again, I can't remember who or why I came to the book, but somebody must have said, you should read this for some reason. And as I was reading it, the thing that really stuck with me is sort of the thing that I, kind of came to by the end of the book. It's like, when I started working on Paula's case, I very much identified with Paula. We're not the same. She had different circumstances than I did, but I sort of got she just seemed like this sort of fiery, smart, young girl who was wanted to have a good time and, be social. And I really, I feel like as an 18-year-old, that's how I just, but also, her parents had just gone through a divorce as mine had. I think there was a lot of acting out in anger as I did. And so I really related to her in that way at the beginning of the writing process. But then by the end of the book, after doing all of the research and really trying to understand what happened to her, I really related to her mother, because I feel like, her mother and her, were sort of on the outs when this all happened. There were rifts between them. And I think so much of it, comes down to the fact that her mother was really afraid for her, and now as a mother myself, especially the mother of a daughter, I relate to that. I'm no longer afraid for myself. I don't, these true crime things don't scare me anymore because I'm just past that age now, I guess. But now knowing that my daughter will someday be a teenager and in her 20s, and again, what I said earlier about I want her to go out and be fiery and, have her fun, but I don't want her to, I don't want her to get hurt. Right. But so back to Ellroy, the thing that really stuck with me in that book is that I realized basically that arc through that book, because in that book, oh my God, there's just these, it's a harrowing book. Have you read it?
Yes.
It's just instance after instance after instance of crimes against women in the smallest section of California during a very small period of time. It's shocking, jaw-dropping, just the number of horrific things that can happen in one little place. But for some reason I was sort of able to read it and get through it, and it didn't affect me in a way where I couldn't read it. Right. But then I came to this one story that he tells about a woman who was murdered, and in front of her her like 2-year-old daughter, and I don't even know if I can say it now, I'll probably start crying, but like the daughter, dies because there's no one there to take care of her, and she like pulls out her hair and she's not eaten, and it's just awful. And as I was reading this, suddenly I'm like laying, in my bed, and I'm just weeping for this little girl. And that really sort of showed me that now I was in this new place. Like, again, I'm no longer worried for myself. Now I'm worried for my children. And,
Right. Do people ask you how you could delve in and spend years of your life in such a dark place? I've been asked that about the other book.
yeah, yes, I get that a lot. And actually, going back to my children, one thing that's really interesting, so since the book has been out and I've had a couple close friends read it, I had two women say to me almost nearly the exact same thing and point to the same scene where they said, how could you be doing this while you had like basically a newborn at home? Like, how could you be? And they pointed to a scene where I was trying to phone a nurse that I had learned about from the case file, who might or might not have been present when Paula died. And so, my 18-month-old son is like sleeping on the at one side of the wall, and I'm on the other side, bringing this nurse over and over. And they're like, I couldn't shower. Like, how were you making these calls? And I realized that, like, for me, it became this sort of perfect balance. I needed to think about Paula and to think about, something that I felt was really important, and to, consider her case and how I was going to write this book. This was the way that I activated my mind when I was, a new mother. But then simultaneously, that darkness, because it is dark, I was able to find joy in my child and now children. I had two kids during the course of writing this book. And then so it worked out to be this balance. And I honestly don't know if I could have done one without the other. Like, I don't, there definitely wouldn't be a Paula book were I not a mother. And I think I'm a better mother because I was working and writing. And what about you? How did you answer those questions?
I was fascinated by the attempt to crack the case, and the whole detective chase was very interesting. But more than that, I know you feel the same way about Paula. I didn't like the idea that Kitty Genovese was known as this person whose name was only familiar for being killed.
Yeah.
And she must have had a full life. And it turns out she did have a remarkable full life in a remarkable place. I mean, New York City in the early 60s, she and her partner, Marianne Zelenko, are getting on the subway and going downtown. This is 5 years before Stonewall, and they couldn't hold hands even in Greenwich Village in New York City in those days. They're going to Hootenannies. Bob Dylan is new in town, but they don't like him. He's the interloper. They like Dave Van Ronk, the mayor of McDougal Street. And just to immerse oneself in a remarkable time and place. And that's certainly one of the most interesting things about trying to write a book that doesn't happen today.
Yeah, that really struck me about your book. Your portrait of Kitty is just so beautiful and rich and full. Like, she just sounded like someone I would have wanted to know and to have known. And just sounded.
Yeah, it makes you. I mean, I could feel. I mean, one can feel in reading. I think the reader wants to know Paula, and that's one of the fine things about what happened to Paula, that you want to know more, and you feel the way that you were drawn into this story. And I think there are similarities between true crime books, like or many others, but in some ways yours is more timely and I think a special one.
Thank you so much for saying so.
Shall we see if John has a question or two for us?
Sure, yes.
All right. So yeah, so you guys have touched a little on some of the questions, but so Katherine, you talked a little bit about how you hadn't really read much true crime. How about you, Kevin? Since you write a lot of nonfiction, were there any true crime books that you read that kind of made you want to jump into it?
Many. I mean, the Jeffrey McDonald story. It's true. The really best true crime, it seems to me, plays out in your mind exactly as if it were a movie or a TV show. So I can't read the Jeffrey McDonald story without seeing Gary Cole's great television performance. I came into it. The first thing I remember about Kitty Genovese was a brilliant short story by Harlan Ellison, who actually gave a nice blurb for the book. And it was certainly not true crime, but it was the most heightened sort of James Elroy sort of science fiction, speculative fiction. And it was called The Whimper of Whipped Dogs, a very difficult story. And I think the best true crime, of course, shares a lot with a lot of other good writing. I mean, it's not true crime, but some of my favorite fake crime, false crime, fictional crime is by Elmore Leonard, who gave what I always considered like the best writing tip a person ever gave. Is Elmore Leonard said, you should leave out the boring parts.
And how about you, Katherine? So if you're reading, not true crime stuff, if you're reading for pleasure, what are some of the things that you pick up?
I've been reading a lot of essays lately. I read the new Gia Tolentino book, Trick Mirror, which is excellent. I could watch her think about anything. And Rachel Cusk, I'm blanking on the name of her book of essays. It came out maybe 2 years ago. Also excellent. And the new Leslie Jameson, Make It Scream, Make It Burn. And I also have some true crime recommendations. I like, I mentioned the Becky Cooper book, which was excellent last year. The Third Rainbow Girl by Emma Copley Eisenberg was out, I believe, last year. Mm-hmm. Also, maybe 2 years ago. Also an excellent book. Yeah.
So Arlene wants to know, for both of you, what do you do to take a break from the immersive nature of your writing so it doesn't become too consuming? Let's start with Katherine.
Oh my gosh. Well, I wish that I could get consumed in my writing. This pandemic has been very difficult. Like I said, I have 2 young children and homeschooling and all of that. So I don't often get to write. So I don't get to take a break either.
How about you, Kevin?
I follow baseball incessantly and play golf badly.
And so the second half of Arlene's question is, she says, how has your writing or subject matter affected your view of human nature in general and the direction of your future writing craft? Let's start with Kevin.
What a good question. I think writing about Kitty Genovese made me feel very sad about her individual fate and somewhat hopeful about things that came out of the outcry over her death and the fact that there are more witnesses today. I think one of the very interesting facets of murders in the very recent past is that they happened under cover of darkness and nobody could say for sure what happened. And today there are so many cameras. There are so many surveillance cameras that I wonder whether such a thing could take place. Is this going to solve certainly many, many murders that would have gone unsolved otherwise? I'm sure we're going to have fascinating cases in which the surveillance cams seem to disagree or don't cover what we need to see. But that's surely going to be a big factor, it seems to me, in near future true crime stories in which all of the surveillance we have today is put in play.
Would you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. How has your writing and subject matter affected your view of human nature in general and the direction of your future writing and craft?
Yeah, so this book has changed me completely. Like I said, it happened simultaneously with my motherhood. So it's hard to know, to pull apart which was which, but you know, I very much like didn't, you know, I was raised in a generation that was very much, you know, you can do whatever you want. You're a woman. That's great. You know, and that's how my parents raised me. And that's what I truly believed. And I didn't really think of my womanhood as anything, until this book. And then when I started to consider it, you know, not only did I realize that like it was, my womanhood was complex and it came with responsibility, but I also saw that all the women around me, they just came into, you know, hyper focus for me. And so I'm, you know, I'm both, you know, excited by, you know, the things that I see the women around me doing, and excited to, you know, move that forward.
And so Susan asks, she says, Katherine, it sounds as if you write about people that you know or you have a connection with. Do you think that you will write about other cold cases of people you don't know in order to bring them to the public attention?
Oh, honestly, I don't. I think that the thing that interests me most about Paula's case is, like I said, the fact that she might have been pregnant. Like I think my next project will probably have to do with pregnant young girls. Like that's a population that I'm really interested in. So I don't know. I mean, if that has to do with a cold case or some sort of crime, yeah, but I feel like it's not cold cases that are the interest. It's young women.
And how about you, Kevin? Is there anything that you're working on or anything that you would like to tackle next?
I have a new book out about a subject that's fascinated me for years. It's about the space program in the 1980s, and particularly the Challenger shuttle mission that had Teacher in Space, Krista McAuliffe, on it. And another instance of just something from the recent American past that seemed worth delving more deeply into.
And that's Burning Blue?
That is.
Burning Blue. Okay. Yep.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Just last week, right?
It did. It came out last week, and it's you know, as you well know, Katherine, it's an interesting time when one's book goes out into the world.
Yes, it is.
So you Katherine, you touched on it a little bit. What has the writing process been like for you guys kind of in the last year with the pandemic? Have you been able to get any writing done? Have you not? What's that been like? Let's start with Kevin.
I found it to be a very interesting job to have during a pandemic. You can get most of your work done. I was very lucky to do almost all of my in-person work for the book called The Burning Blue just before the pandemic hit. And then you have a chance to do the work. And as always, the gnomes who are supposed to come in the middle of the night and write the book for you never do. But it's a good time when the world is shut down and there really aren't very many distractions. I found it to be a somewhat useful time to sit down and try to produce pages.
And Katherine, it sounds like it was the opposite for you.
Yeah, well, you know what? So I'm going to qualify that because I did find the pandemic very challenging with regard to home life. Like my husband's working in the basement. We've got 2 young children, both of whom are homeschooling. Like we live in a small house where everybody can hear one another. Like it was extremely challenging with regard to getting everybody's needs met. However, I think because I was, you know, I knew this book was coming out, and like I look back over the last, 6-9 months, and I think I was more prolific in the last, 9 months than I was in any other given year. I worked 6 years on this book, but in the last 9 months, I've written like 7 or 8 essays that I think are all pretty strong. And, so that is, it wasn't easy, but I did it.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us this evening. So to recap, for anybody who might have joined us late, we have been chatting with Katherine Dykstra, whose book, What Happened to Paula, has just come out. And Kevin Cook has been kind enough to chat with us. As he mentioned, he has a new book, The Burning Blue, that has just come out. You can order either of them from us at murderbooks.com. As we mentioned, we have signed book plates to go with Katherine's. If you missed any part of our chat once we are done, Facebook and YouTube will archive it, so you'll be able to rewatch it. Sometimes YouTube takes just a little bit longer to get that up, but it'll be up. And while you're there, we hope you will also scroll through some of the other author events we've done. I think I've lost count at this point. We've done definitely over 200 of them with probably at this point close to 400 authors. So there's lots of content out there. We hope that you guys will check that out. Katherine and Kevin, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
You guys take care. We'll see you soon.
Okay.
Good night.